So one thing I want to mention here before I tell you these 20 causes that I'm about to show you is that one thing that we know is not a real cause of low morning cortisol levels is chronic stress, okay, which is the central theory of adrenal fatigue. They're basically, the whole idea of adrenal fatigue is that chronic stress of various kinds results in low morning cortisol levels. So you have practitioners out there who are seeing low morning cortisol levels and they go, it's chronic stress that's causing this. Well, what I've already shown you is that if you actually look to the evidence, you can see very clearly that chronic stress is almost never associated with low morning cortisol levels. So that whole theory is very clearly wrong. Let's look at what the evidence actually shows are things that do reliably result in low morning cortisol levels. And there's 20 of them. If you look in the scientific literature, there's 20 that I have found, and I've dug in thousands of studies to find every conceivable factor that relates to this. Some of these are stronger than others. Some of these we have lots of really great evidence showing very clear, very big effects. And others of these are things that don't have super strong evidence or show only relatively weak effects. And I'll try and differentiate between those as we go through this. I'm also going to skip over some of these that are relatively minor factors. If you want to go dig through all the science and the specific studies on each of these, I have that information in the article with the links to the actual research. But I'll show you some of the biggest factors right now. Number one is night owl chronotype. This is whether you're more of a morning person or a night person. And to illustrate this, and this is, by the way, one of the most important factors in low morning cortisol levels. This one thing by itself, you're not even looking at any of the other 19 factors, just this one thing is enough to create low morning cortisol levels and get people diagnosed with adrenal fatigue. So to illustrate this point, let me just give a hypothetical example. Let's say you took 100 people and they're 100 perfectly healthy people, no chronic stress, no symptoms, no fatigue, none of that stuff. Okay, perfectly healthy people who are non-stressed. You have 100 of them. You divide them into two groups of 50 based on whether they're either morning people or night owls. Okay, here's what you will find when you actually analyze those healthy people's cortisol levels. Turns out that this study is not just hypothetical, it's actually been done. And this is what you find. You find a graph that looks like this, which is an actual screenshot from a study looking at morning cortisol levels in people, healthy people, no fatigue or burnout, who are either morning people, which is this red line you see here, or evening, night people, which is this green dashed line that you see here. And you also have a normal type here, which is sort of closer to the morning type. So what do you notice here? Well, if you look at these numbers and these cortisol levels, basically what you can see is that literally the morning people and normal types have nearly twice the amount of cortisol. So this isn't just a minor, very slight effect, barely statistically significant. This is a huge, huge effect from just this one factor in perfectly healthy people without stress and without symptoms of burnout or exhaustion or fatigue. You're seeing a massive difference in cortisol levels. So just going to bed late and being more of a night person, and in the modern world, most people have been shifted in that direction as a result of artificial light in the environment and just the way modern life has worked and the modern environment has worked with electricity and artificial lighting and electronic devices. We've all been shifted more into a night owl rhythm. And as a result of that, we all have been shifted towards lower morning cortisol levels. Now, I also want to emphasize one more thing here. This is in normal, healthy people, but these levels by themselves, just a person showing up with levels like this, what this night owl group is showing up with, is enough to have many practitioners say, whoa, you have adrenal fatigue. You must be under chronic stress and your adrenals are burned out. When in fact, that's not actually happening at all. This person is perfectly healthy, doesn't have any symptoms. They're simply a night person, and their body shifts into a slightly different rhythm of cortisol secretion as a result of simply being a night person. Now, if you're wondering, this isn't the only study that has tested this. And turns out there are many studies that have tested this, and they all find the same thing. So if you're watching the video, I'm showing screenshots along with quotes from the conclusions of these studies. They all show the same thing. There's a big, big difference between morning types and evening types. And this is a major factor in why people are showing up with low morning cortisol levels. So this is a study from a study called Chronotype Sleep Loss and the Diurnal Pattern of Salivary Cortisol. And what they said here in the conclusion is evening-oriented types showed lower salivary cortisol levels and a flattened diurnal curve in comparison with morning types. Here's another screenshot of a study. So you can see, again, huge differences between morning types and evening types. So no chronic stress or burnout or fatigue necessary to induce these effects. All you need to do is just go to bed late, and you will have low morning cortisol levels and a flattened diurnal curve. So it's that simple. So while you can look at all this research, and I just want to emphasize this again for the sake of clarity, because you can look at all this research around this theory of adrenal fatigue and how chronic stress is supposed to cause this pattern in cortisol levels, and it doesn't. The research very clearly shows that chronic stress of all sorts of different types of chronic stress almost never results in this type of cortisol pattern. What does reliably result in this cortisol pattern? Simply being a night owl, okay? Number two, and in a similar vein related to this concept of circadian rhythm, which is the body's biological clock. We have a 24-hour clock built into our brain. It's in a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it regulates all sorts of different neurotransmitters and hormones that control lots of different aspects of metabolic functions and hunger and appetite and energy levels and all sorts of different things, the functions of different organs, our sleep and wake schedules, brain function at different times of the day, neurotransmitters and moods. It controls all kinds of things. One of the biggest things that impacts your circadian rhythm is light, and specifically morning light exposure within the first hour of the day. And if you're not getting, as most people are not, if you're not getting bright outdoor sunlight within the first hour after you wake up, then you have poor circadian rhythm habits. And as a result of that, we know from lots of studies that lack of morning light exposure will cause low morning cortisol levels and more of a flattened diurnal curve in cortisol levels. So for example, if you look at people who live in, for example, the Pacific Northwest or other northern latitude places that are overcast for several months of the year, where they go a period of the year where they're not getting enough light exposure, they can get seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, S-A-D. And one of the classic treatments for seasonal affective disorder is morning bright light therapy with a bright light device. One of the things that we know that does is it raises your morning cortisol levels. So this has a big, big impact on cortisol levels. Light exposure habits really matter a lot here. Circadian rhythm as a whole matters a ton here, because remember, the pattern of cortisol over the course of the day is one of the hormones that is regulated by your circadian rhythm. Okay, so it follows this pattern over the course of 24 hours where you get a big surge in the morning, and then it decreases over the rest of the day and gets lower and lower and lower in the evening and the night hours, and then rises the next day. So that rise and fall, having that function optimally and be at optimal levels, depends massively on your circadian rhythm. So it depends on your light exposure habits. It also depends on whether you're a morning or a night owl. And this is just to name a couple of the many different aspects of circadian rhythm habits that we can talk about. For example, in my Energy Blueprint program, I talk about 17 different habits for optimizing your circadian rhythm. And there are several studies, as you're seeing on the screen here, that have verified this aspect of the importance of bright light exposure for cortisol. Another aspect of this is that we're spending most of our days indoors in dim lighting conditions that are a fraction as bright as outdoor conditions. And so not only we're not getting it throughout the day, but we're not getting it in the most important time, which is within the first hour after we wake up. So we have major light exposure problems in the modern world, and that absolutely impacts our circadian rhythm, which absolutely impacts the diurnal or circadian rhythm of our cortisol secretion. So we get that flattened diurnal curve, low morning cortisol levels, and elevated evening cortisol levels. Number 3, again, another habit that affects your circadian rhythm is late night eating. There's also research here showing that eating too late at night can also lead to low morning cortisol levels. Number 4, excess body fat. This is another factor where we have evidence showing that the more overweight you are, you can see these lines here on this graph on the screen if you're watching the video. You have grade 1, you have normal people, normal body fat percentage, then you have grade 1 overweight, and then grade 2 and 3 overweight. The more overweight you are, the flatter your morning rise in cortisol levels get. So you have less of a peak and less overall cortisol secretion. Number 5, there are medications, very common over-the-counter and prescription medications that are taken by millions of people that impact cortisol. So one example of this is many common antidepressants. This is a screenshot here. You can see of one study where they showed people who are depressed who are either taking antidepressants or not taking antidepressants. The group on antidepressants has significantly lower cortisol levels. Other medications that can affect it: Xanax, aspirin, very common, Tylenol, very common, gabapentin, opioid medications. There's a huge opioid epidemic going on right now, blood pressure lowering drugs, and then many anti-inflammatory and pain-killing drugs, like, for example, Celebrex and Vioxx and things like that. Very, very common medications taken by millions of people have been proven to disturb cortisol levels, either cortisol synthesis or production. Number 6, nutrient deficiencies. This is something I would say is relatively weak evidence, but also is logical. We know that certain compounds are involved in cortisol synthesis, and we know that, deficiencies in the number of these compounds are pretty common. So it's reasonable to speculate that this may be a factor in cortisol levels. Things like niacin derivatives, vitamin C, folic acid, other B vitamins, calcium, potassium, zinc, and iron are all compounds that can potentially affect cortisol levels. Not a lot of evidence, not very strong evidence that does exist here, but it's mostly just because it hasn't been tested. So if there were clear tests on this, I believe it would be shown that nutrient deficiencies are playing a role here. Other factors: there are a variety of psychological and psychosocial factors that are linked with lower morning cortisol levels or a flattened diurnal curve of cortisol levels. So I think overall, these are probably not major factors, and it's also hard to differentiate correlation from causation. But I do want to mention that some of these psychological factors and psychosocial factors have been linked with low morning cortisol levels. So I'll mention this briefly. If you want to explore this in depth, go check out the article. So high levels of depression and/or high perceived suffering. And there's screenshots of the research for these, but I'm skipping over this. So rumination and neuroticism, other factors. If you're somebody who tends to ruminate and you're highly neurotic, those traits are also linked with low morning cortisol levels. Perceived helplessness or hopelessness, low self-esteem, and low perceived coping ability. Also including low social support and low psychosocial resources. All of these things have been linked with low morning cortisol levels. Number 10 is cynicism. Again, research linking that. Lower socioeconomic status. You can see a screenshot here talking about socioeconomic status in relationship to cortisol levels. I think this is a relatively minor factor, as you can see here from this, this screenshot of the cortisol graph. Recent loss of a partner or social isolation and loneliness has also been linked with lower cortisol levels. Ethnicity, there's some indication that Caucasians generally have slightly higher morning rises in cortisol levels compared to Blacks and Hispanics. So that's also probably a relatively minor factor in the grand scheme of things, but I just wanted to mention that along with some of these psychological and psychosocial factors. Number 14, low physical activity levels and being more sedentary. So now we're getting into more physical factors. You can see here from this graph, the black line here with a nice, strong morning level of cortisol and then a steep fall over the course of the day. So this is the opposite of a flattened diurnal curve. This is a strong diurnal curve of cortisol levels. That is in people with high physical activity levels. And then you can see as the different groups of people with lower and lower physical activity levels, as physical activity drops, the cortisol curve flattens out. You have lower morning levels and higher evening levels. So this is another big factor. Number 15, anticipation of low demands in the upcoming day. So this is one that you generally will never hear people talking about and is counterintuitive and is also pretty darn cool. So here's a screenshot from a study, and there's a few interesting things to note about this screenshot or this particular graph, where they looked at people who were burned out at work and chronically stressed versus those who were engaged and happy and non-burned out. That's one thing. So they're comparing that, but they're also comparing those same individuals, measuring their cortisol levels on weekdays, work days, versus weekend non-work days. So a couple things that they found. First of all, I want to note that there were no differences in cortisol levels between the people with burnout and the engaged people without burnout. So that's the first thing to note, in line with all the research that I shared with you already, showing that you cannot differentiate burned out, chronically fatigued, chronically stressed people from non-stressed people based on cortisol levels. Those symptoms do not show up. They don't show up in terms of cortisol measurements. And in other words, cortisol is not a valid biomarker of these symptoms and is not a good explanatory factor for these symptoms. So that's the first thing. But in terms of this specific factor, here's what you do see. All these dashed lines down here, you see this grouping of the 3 dashed lines here and then the 3 solid lines up here. What that's all about is basically that these solid lines are people on their work days. So it's the same groups of people. This is just when they had a work day and they took their morning cortisol measurements. And down here, these dashed lines are on non-work days. So in the same groups of people, just having a day off of work dramatically lowered cortisol levels by roughly 50% or so. I mean, a huge reduction just by having a day off of work. And what that's about is that part of what this morning rise in cortisol levels is about is sort of prepping your physiology, prepping the organs and systems of your body for the demands of the upcoming day. So if you are getting up and you have things that you need to go and accomplish that day, you're going to have a strong surge of cortisol. If you don't have work that day, if you don't have specific goals and tasks that you need to accomplish that day, you're going to have a much less strong surge in morning cortisol levels. So again, this is kind of counterintuitive, but it's while chronic stress is not linked with a sort of pattern of lower morning cortisol levels, what is linked with it is simply having a day off of work. Number 16, psychological trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, or childhood adversity, or adverse childhood events, or ACEs. So all of these sorts of past trauma, past abuse, post-traumatic stress, any of that sort of past trauma absolutely is linked with a lasting effect on the cortisol secretion pattern. So as I mentioned before, there's research, plenty of research, basically strongly implicating that this factor is clearly associated with low morning cortisol levels. Now, it is not low morning cortisol or low cortisol in general to the point where it's suggestive of any abnormality of the adrenals or inability of the adrenals to produce enough cortisol. it's still within the normal range, but what it's suggesting is that there's some sort of adaptive pattern in people who have undergone trauma where the body's stress system rewires a little bit and starts to produce hormones in a slightly different way. And it's probably, I don't know that anybody has a really good answer as to what exactly the reason is, but it's most likely some sort of protective, adaptive mechanism that rewires the stress response pathways in people who have undergone trauma. And part of that rewiring involves lowering morning cortisol levels. Number 17, there is also some potential for genetic influences here. There's a rare condition where people can have 21 hydroxylase deficiency. That is a deficiency in a particular enzyme involved in cortisol synthesis. And it's if you have a particular gene variant of CYP21A, that particular genetic SNP, then you can potentially, that may, this is a bit speculative, but it may result in lower cortisol levels as a result of 21 hydroxylase deficiency. And this is something called familial glucocorticoid deficiency. It's a real thing. It's just a relatively rare thing. And this is probably not at all what's going on in the vast majority of people with low morning cortisol levels. I also want to mention that there's some research suggesting that there's some intergenerational transmission of trauma, for example. So, for example, if you look at maybe Holocaust survivors or people who have, gone on, who have suffered through some big traumas or gone through wars of various kinds, it is possible that that sort of rewiring of the stress response pathways that I mentioned previously with PTSD or childhood traumas, that can actually be passed transgenerationally, epigenetically, and sort of rewire the stress response pathways of the children as well. Number 18, toxins. There are a variety of different toxins that have been shown to impact levels of cortisol in the blood. So for example, glyphosate, endocrine disrupting chemicals, BPA, phthalates. I'm showing a variety of studies on the screen here. Heavy metals, so things like lead and mercury and arsenic. Various other kinds of pesticides, fungicides, compounds found in plastic. For example, one study showed that exposure to arsenic decreased activity of the enzyme 3-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, which is a key mitochondrial enzyme used in the first step of the pathway converting cholesterol into cortisol. Another study observed the inhibiting effect of azole fungicides, for example, like glyphosate, on an enzyme called steroid 21 hydroxylase, which is a critical enzyme involved in the production of cortisol. Also note that people who live in very agricultural or industrial parts of the country may be exposed to unhealthy levels of these azole fungicides and pesticides like glyphosate. And this is a screenshot of a study where they looked at aluminum levels in the body, sort of the body burden of aluminum levels through aluminum in the floating around in the bloodstream, and they looked at cortisol levels floating around in the bloodstream. And you can see this line showing a general correlation that as levels of aluminum go up, levels of cortisol go down. Now keep in mind, this is just one metal. Let's say if instead of just looking at this in relationship to aluminum only, they did aluminum and lead and mercury and thallium and cadmium and BPA and phthalates and load of pesticides and fungicides and glyphosate, and they looked at total body burden of all those different toxins here, and they charted that in relationship to cortisol. I suspect that they would see a very, very strong and clear correlation between as body burden of those toxins goes up, cortisol levels drops. So that is another factor that is likely impacting cortisol levels. Also keep in mind, living in the modern Western world, many of these chemicals are ubiquitous. We're all being exposed to at least small amounts. Even those of us who are extremely health conscious are being exposed to at least small amounts. And certainly those of us who are not extremely health conscious have probably been getting exposed to very significant amounts of many dozens of these different toxins for years or decades. Number 19, this is a very interesting one based on a study in chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis, where they were basically trying to assess whether in the people who have low morning cortisol levels, if that is a cause of the condition or if it's secondary to other factors. And basically what they showed, and this is a fascinating study for anybody interested in geeking out on the science, I would highly encourage you to go and read this study. It's from 2017, published in the Journal of Molecular Neurobiology, and it's titled Hypothalamic Pituitary Adrenal Hypofunction in Myalgic Encephalomyelitis and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome as a consequence of activated immune, inflammatory, and oxidative and nitrosative pathways. So that's the title of the study, but basically what they found is that in the people who have low morning cortisol levels or low cortisol levels in general, it is most likely a consequence and not a cause of a wide variety of activated immune and inflammatory and oxidative and nitrosative stress pathways in that illness. So in other words, you have things that are promoting chronic inflammation, chronic immune activation, and chronic oxidative and what's called nitrosative stress at the cellular level. You can just think of that as molecules that are causing damage at the cellular level. And all of those things tend to go together. So chronic inflammation and immune activation and chronic cellular damage from oxidative and nitrosative stress. All of that tends to be a vicious cycle that tends to co-occur. So as a consequence to that, you can get lowered cortisol levels. Now, I'll explain why that is in a moment, but just so you understand what are causes of chronic oxidative stress, chronic inflammation, chronic immune overactivation. Well, for example, you can have chronic exposure of various kinds of toxins, like the ones I just mentioned, heavy metals, endocrine disrupting chemicals, mitochondrial disrupting chemicals. These things are ubiquitous. You can have things like chronic mold exposure, chronic infections, junk food, processed food, the modern food supply, the modern water supply. If you don't have a great quality filter, you're getting things like fluoride, you're getting things like chlorine disinfection byproducts, ammonia, many other different types of toxins in your water supply. There's pollutants in the air. We're all being exposed to these to a large degree, but in severe cases, for example, in chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis, there's oftentimes very severe immune and inflammatory dysregulation in those conditions. And as a result of that, it may be impacting on cortisol levels. So basically, there's a sort of tug-of-war going on. So cortisol is an anti-inflammatory hormone, and it also suppresses immune function. So essentially, these inflammatory and immune processes that are activated when you have exposure to toxins or to mold or to infections or junk food, things like that, those tend to be activated in order to perform protective roles. Cortisol, if it's too high, will suppress that reaction. So basically, the body's forced into trying to figure out which one of these things it's going to prioritize. Is it going to prioritize cortisol and what cortisol is trying to do, or is it going to prioritize the immune and inflammatory systems? So basically, there's that sort of tug-of-war going on there. With that in mind, here is a quote from researchers from a study called Chronic Stress in the HPA Axis. They said, quote, "Some researchers believe that the adaptation by the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is a protective device to ensure long-term survival by preventing chronically high cortisol levels from suppressing immune function." So again, that's getting at this tug of war where the body is trying to decide whether it needs to activate more of the immune and inflammatory pathways to fight against certain things like pathogens or toxins, for example, or whether it's going to activate cortisol. And because of that fight, there may be some sort of protective adaptation where the body is intentionally lowering cortisol levels in order to facilitate the activation of other systems of the body. Number 20, and this is like some of these circadian rhythm factors that I mentioned earlier, one of the single biggest, if not the single biggest factor in terms of low morning cortisol levels. And that is simply poor sleep or lack of sleep, any combination of that. And there are a whole bunch of studies showing that essentially any disturbance of sleep, whether it is overt sleep disorders, movement disorders, or sleep apnea, or whether it's simply not sleeping enough hours, as is extremely common in the majority of people, or poor sleep efficiency, which is that you have poor circadian rhythm habits, and so you're not sleeping deeply, and your body's not spending enough time in the deep rejuvenative phases of sleep, which is also extremely common due to poor circadian rhythm habits. All of that has a huge impact on morning cortisol levels. And just this one factor by itself, just let's say you chronically undersleep by 1 to 2 hours, under what your body actually needs, or let's say you have poor circadian rhythm habits, as most people do, just that one thing by itself can cause the pattern of cortisol secretion that would get a person diagnosed with adrenal fatigue by somebody who believes in adrenal fatigue. So you see here many studies on the screen about this. Again, this can be from either not having enough hours of sleep or from sleep disorders or sleep apnea, or simply poor circadian rhythm and sleep hygiene habits that result in poor, what's called sleep efficiency, which is sort of how restful and rejuvenative your sleep is per hour that you're asleep. Again, I just want to emphasize there's no need for chronic stress over months and years to exhaust the adrenal glands. And we know from the research that that type of stress isn't even associated with this pattern of low morning cortisol levels. But poor sleep, even just a few nights of poor sleep, will cause this exact same cortisol abnormality that some people think is quote unquote adrenal fatigue. This is a study called Stress-Related Exhaustion Disorder, Clinical Manifestation of Burnout, a review of the research. And they said, quote, the data supports the notion that sleep impairments are causative and maintaining factors for this condition. Another one, very interesting study where they asked people to just do short-term night shift working. So they just disrupted their circadian rhythm basically and had them do night shift work. Well, guess what? Within a few days, no need for years of chronic stress, months or years of chronic stressors to wear out your adrenal glands. Within a few days of simply disrupting your circadian rhythm, you will have the exact same neuroendocrine abnormality or cortisol abnormality that some people think is adrenal fatigue. So they said, quote, neuroendocrine abnormalities, i.e. low morning cortisol, reported to be characteristic of chronic fatigue syndrome, may be merely the consequence of disrupted sleep and social routine. Contrary to the views of adrenal fatigue proponents, the solution to this situation is not to take adrenal support formulas or take cortisol or from hydrocortisone or adrenal glandulars. It is to fix your circadian rhythm and sleep patterns. That is the major cause of most people's cortisol abnormalities. So at this point, we've debunked the theory of adrenal fatigue. We've seen that the evidence doesn't actually support the idea that there are these 3 phases by which chronic stress wears out our adrenal system and causes low cortisol levels. And we've also seen that the idea that that process of adrenal dysfunction or adrenal burnout and low cortisol levels is not actually linked with the fatigue syndromes and stress-related exhaustion disorder and burnout syndrome. So we've also seen, in addition to that, if it's not truly adrenal fatigue from chronic stress and that's resulting in low morning cortisol levels, then what exactly are the factors resulting in low morning cortisol levels? Well, I just showed you 20 factors that are actually supported by the evidence. Unlike the idea that chronic stress wears out the adrenal glands, there is actually a lot of evidence showing that simple things like circadian rhythm disruption, or poor sleep, or sleep disorders, or not enough sleep, or not getting morning light exposure, or eating too late at night, or a variety of other things that I just showed you, directly can lead to low morning cortisol levels, as well as things like certain medications, over-the-counter and prescription medications, being a night owl chronotype, night eating, being more sedentary, carrying excess body fat, and a number of other ones, chronic inflammation and oxidative stress, right? We've seen how there's a number of factors that are actually supportable by the scientific evidence showing that they drive low morning cortisol levels. So having said all of that, debunked the concept of adrenal fatigue, shown you the real reasons for low morning cortisol levels, let's get practical on how to actually correct your low morning cortisol levels if you have them. Now, again, I just want to mention that this is not what I'm recommending as the path to focus on in order to fix the fatigue, right? Because if it's not truly low cortisol levels that are causing the problem in the first place, the solution is not to fix your cortisol levels. But specifically for those of you who do have low morning cortisol levels, I want to show you not only what's likely causing it, but how to fix it without taking adrenal supplements or taking cortisone or trying to do all of these other theories of strategies that are built around this concept of adrenal fatigue that doesn't actually have evidence to support it. So here's how to actually do it. First of all, make sure that you actually did the test correctly and that you truly do have low cortisol levels. So there are some common errors that can cause measurements of cortisol that you should be skeptical of. So first of all, if you did a one-time measurement of cortisol, there are some tests on the market where you only measure it one time in the mornings. That is not a valid diagnostic tool. So you need to get it retested. A single point in time of a measurement of cortisol is not adequate. So if you did your previous cortisol test on a weekend, on a non-work day, do the test again on a work day. So remember the research I just told you about how just work days versus non-work days cause a very big difference in cortisol levels. If you got a poor night of sleep the night before testing your cortisol levels, take another test after a good night of sleep. And if you did not take your first cortisol measurement within the first 30 minutes of awakening, your results may not be valid. So one of the things we talked about before is this cortisol awakening response. It's very timing specific. And if a lot of people are sort of, not really on it when they take their cortisol measurements. So for example, they kind of wake up and then, 45 minutes later, they remember, oh, I'm supposed to take my cortisol measurements. And, they're just a little bit lackadaisical as far as being really strict with taking the measurements at the right time. If you delay it and you don't take the measurements at the right time, it's very easy to get invalid measurements. So these are common errors in the test that can lead to getting invalid results. So first of all, before you go trying to fix low cortisol, make sure that you actually have low morning cortisol levels. Assuming that you do, and that you don't have a measurement error in the test, then you start to fix those factors that I just took you through. So there's 20 factors that I just took you through in terms of the causes of low morning cortisol levels, or a flattened diurnal curve of cortisol. And you can kind of get a sense as you're listening to all those causes, which are the ones that likely apply most to you. And from there, you can sort of personalize the way that you address it. But again, there are certain ones here that are far and away the biggest and most common factors. So let's take you through these strategies. I'm going to do this in sort of a summarized way. If you want to get all the details, go check out the article on the site. It's theenergyblueprint.com/low-cortisol-levels. So 11 strategies. Number 1, optimize your circadian rhythm. This is the single most important thing for correcting cortisol levels, low morning cortisol levels, or a flattened diurnal curve. So a few quick strategies. I go very, very in-depth in this in my Energy Blueprint program. I have an entire module around circadian and rhythm and sleep. It's one full week of the program, and there's about 25 habits that I take you through. But a few of some of the important ones: get bright light ideally outdoor light, or if you don't have sunlight, if you don't live in a place with that's a sunny place, then use a light therapy device in the morning within the first 30 minutes after waking. Very, very important. Shift your bedtime and wake time earlier to shift away from a night owl rhythm. Block artificial light at night with blue blocking technology, and ideally blue and green blocking glasses. I have a podcast that I've done on that if you're interested in learning more about that. Consistently go to bed and wake up at the same time. That consistency of the sleep cycle from weekdays to weekends is very, very important to keeping your circadian rhythm of your cortisol rhythm intact. Also, consume your last bite of food no later than 2 hours before you sleep, and ideally more than that. Also, get more bright outdoor light during the day. And these are all strategies that can have, just this one thing alone, optimizing your circadian rhythm, and doing some of these things, addressing your, shifting away from a night owl rhythm, getting the light exposure in the morning, blocking the artificial light at night, and shifting your meal timing schedule, getting lots more bright light during the day. These are simple things, but they will absolutely make a huge difference in terms of your cortisol levels throughout the day. Just doing this alone is enough to correct most people's cortisol issues and flattened diurnal curve, low morning cortisol. It's enough to correct it within a few weeks of adopting these habits. Number two, if you have a more serious illness, for example, if you have severe chronic fatigue syndrome, you may have some of that element of chronic oxidative and nitrosative stress, chronic immune and inflammatory overactivation going on, and that may be a key driver of your particular low morning cortisol levels or low cortisol levels in general. So consume anti-inflammatory foods. There's plenty of information on that online as far as sort of general foods with anti-inflammatory processes or effects, I should say. Get rid of inflammatory foods, junk food, processed food. Address gut permeability, very, very important if you have poor gut health. A lot of foods which are actually healthful can have inflammation promoting qualities. Lower your exposure to heavy metals and inflammatory toxins in the food, water, and air supply and your personal care products. I've done several podcasts on those topics as well. So each one of those things I just mentioned in that one bullet point is worthy of several hours of discussion. So I'm giving you the very, very quick, short, summarized version of this stuff here. And follow the lifestyle strategies outlined in this presentation around circadian rhythm that I just told you, sleep, nutrition, and other lifestyle and psychological factors that we're about to get into. Lose excess body fat. That's another one, pretty straightforward. Carrying excess body fat is associated with a flattened diurnal curve of cortisol. Just lowering your body fat percentage is likely to help with your cortisol numbers. Number 4, addressed past psychological, emotional trauma. This can be a big one for many people, and it's also not the easiest thing to do, but here are my recommendations for how to do that. Do psychotherapy or alternative psychotherapeutic methods. Start a dedicated daily meditation or mindfulness practice. Another thing you can do is volunteer for MAPS. That's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And you can be a part of one of their studies using MDMA or psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. The results from the studies on those studies that have been done using MDMA or psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy in the context of, for example, people with post-traumatic stress disorder have been absolutely incredible. So while these compounds are currently, there's legal issues surrounding them, though that's actually starting to change as more and more research accumulates showing benefits. But right now, even with their legal status, it is possible to be part of a study and to volunteer to be a participant in some of these studies. So you can do it that way. Obviously, there's also sort of an underground movement that's going on that's not within the bounds of what is legal, but there are a lot of people doing this on an underground level. If you want to explore that, I would just say, make sure that you do so safely and make sure that you do it with people that are really trustworthy and that you've vetted. You know people who know those people, and you can make sure that these are good people that are trustworthy. But if you have an opportunity to explore that, I would highly encourage it for anybody with past trauma. It can absolutely be life-changing. Also, consider working one-on-one with a trauma release expert. My good friend Nikki Gratrix specializes in this. She does absolutely amazing work with a variety of different psychotherapeutic and alternative psychotherapeutic methods. And I know a whole bunch of people, members of the Energy Blueprint program, that say that working with her has been transformative. So highly recommend that. Number 5, move your body more during the day. So we've also seen that simply being more sedentary and less physically active is another factor that flattens out the diurnal curve of cortisol. So simply moving more and being more physically active can help correct that. Number 6, evening meditation and or yoga. So one of the things that we saw with the cortisol rhythm over the course of the day, the diurnal cortisol curve, is that we have this big spike in the mornings, and then it declines over the rest of the day, and it should be low in the evening. So we want that big spike in the mornings, and we want a big valley where it gets quite low in the evenings. What a flattened diurnal cortisol curve is where you have less of a peak in the morning and you have too high of cortisol levels in the evening. So part of what we want to do to exaggerate that is we want to be, more active in the morning, and we want to get that bright light in the morning, and we want to be planning our day in the morning and things like that. And then in the evening, we want to do the opposite. We want to really have practices that take our brain and body out of work mode and go mode and stress mode, and want to consciously relax the brain and body. And by doing that, by having a conscious practice around that, we can sort of work with the natural curves of how our body actually wants to operate. So that's something that's really excellent that I highly recommend. There are also dozens of health benefits associated with meditation or yoga practices, and lowering cortisol levels is really just one of many dozens of benefits. Number 7, make love or hug and kiss your partner. There's research suggesting that this may release oxytocin, or this does release oxytocin, and there's research suggesting that boost of oxytocin can help decrease cortisol levels. So that, kind of in line with what I just said about amplifying the natural rhythm that your body wants to be in, simply having physical affection with someone, whether sex, kissing, cuddling, whatever it is, just laying next to somebody and spooning, all of those things, this physical displays of love and connection, can also lower cortisol levels in the evening. And in addition, much like yoga and meditation, also have a variety of other health benefits. Number 8, get out in nature. So there's something called forest bathing, or a lot of the research is from Japan, and over there it's called Shinrin-yoku. And they have maybe hundreds of studies, certainly dozens of studies, but probably hundreds of studies now on the health effects of forest bathing, as they call it, which just means walking in a forest or being in nature, to generalize the term outside of just forests. And really absolutely incredible research showing amazing health effects on the body, and one of them is lowering your cortisol levels. So we want to do something like that especially in the afternoon or evening, to kind of amplify that natural curve of cortisol levels. Number 9, address toxins in your body. So going back to one of the main causes, or one of the potential causes of low cortisol levels, is some of these toxins in the environment, heavy metals, azole fungicides, things like aluminum, as well as BPA, and a variety of other toxins have been shown to interfere with blood levels of cortisol. So getting toxins out of your body, cleaning up your diet and your lifestyle habits, your personal care products, your water, the water that you're drinking, in terms of getting a great water filter that actually is effective in filtering out the widest variety of contaminants possible. Very, very important. People don't realize how many toxins are in the water supply. I have another podcast and an article that I've done on that subject as well. But cleaning up your whole nutrition and lifestyle habits, your personal care products and everything, non-toxic kitchen products as well, high-end water filter, nutrition and lifestyle strategies to support liver health, and potentially more aggressive detox protocols, including sauna therapy, as well as various supplements designed to support detoxification. So highly, highly recommend, if you haven't been a health conscious person, living a very clean lifestyle and being highly conscious of the toxins that are in the food supply, in the water supply, in the air, and so on in personal care products. If you haven't been aware of that for many years, you certainly have accumulated lots of body load of toxins of various kinds. So I highly recommend doing this in a systematic way. Number 10, have a distinct difference in your day as far as time to work and time to relax. And I was kind of alluding to this a minute ago with the evening meditation and yoga. But remember, it's natural for cortisol to rise strongly in the morning after awakening, and then to decline the rest of the day and get low in the afternoon, the evening, and the night. So you want to facilitate and amplify this natural rise and fall during the day and night through your lifestyle habits. So get up and get moving in the morning, physically and psychologically. Get bright outdoor light, physically move your body and get your brain working. Also, kind of in line with that research that I talked to you about on cortisol levels on work days versus non-work days, get your brain involved in the act of goal planning. Plan out your day, what tasks you want to accomplish that day, and get mentally prepared for tackling those tasks. All of these things will help stimulate a proper morning cortisol release and amplify that natural rhythm that you want to have, and get you out of that flat cortisol rhythm. The second thing is, in the last few hours of the day, wind down and do things that are relaxing and don't involve the same level of hustle and stress as the morning and afternoon. So stop working, stop doing things that are demanding, stop checking emails, stop doing anything that is stressful and keeps your mind racing, okay? And start consciously integrating things like meditation or yoga, or going outside and walking in nature, or doing some kind of stretching routine, or foam rolling, or getting a massage, or having sex, or cuddling, or anything that's going to amplify the brain and body relaxation. Number 11, optimize your sleep. And like circadian rhythm, I think circadian rhythm and sleep are probably the two biggest factors here, and they're very much intertwined, right? So circadian rhythm is what is the biological clock that's regulating our sleep and wake cycles. So a big part of optimizing your sleep means to optimize your circadian rhythm first. Sleep depends on having an optimal circadian rhythm. So start with those circadian rhythm habits that I already mentioned. There's also a pre-bed ritual that I give in the article that I highly recommend following. And also this thing, the last point that I just mentioned about amplifying the natural rise and fall of cortisol, and kind of having your evening time with some sort of relaxing, brain and body relaxing rituals or habits that you have, is absolutely key to start to get the brain into stress mode. A few other things: sleep in complete darkness. So that might mean getting blackout shades, or if that's impossible, then at least get an eye mask. And this is just a few points. This is a topic, optimizing your sleep. This is something that we could go very, very deep on and talk for 3 hours just on this topic alone, but I'm trying to give you some quick practical tips here. Sleep on a very high quality mattress, proven to enhance sleep quality. The one that I recommend most strongly is called IntelliBed. Get electronic devices out of your room, and/or make sure you're not exposed to blue light or significant electromagnetic fields. So also I'd recommend checking, if you can, electromagnetic fields around your bed, because there's research showing that can actually impair melatonin secretion by the brain as well. Obviously, blue light from indoor lighting, from electronic devices, cell phones, tablets, computers, etc., that impairs circadian rhythm, as I talked about before. If you normally wake up extremely unrefreshed, get checked for sleep apnea. This is also, especially if you have a partner that you sleep next to, and they're saying that you snore or have other concerning sort of behaviors while you're sleeping, and you often wake up as if you haven't slept at all and you're still extremely tired even after you've been in bed for 8 or 9 hours, get checked for a sleep disorder or sleep apnea. And the last one is have a relaxing pre-bed ritual for 1 to 2 hours before bed. And this can entail a variety of different things. It can be structured in different ways. Part of it can be journaling and planning out your day for tomorrow. So you kind of get those thoughts out on paper and they're not stuck in your head, rattling around, sort of keeping you in a slightly more stressed state while you're trying to sleep. Another part of it may be meditation, or there's also something called yoga nidra, which is actually not sort of yoga like you're stretching, but is more something about just laying on your back and consciously relaxing different parts of your body. Doing a stretching or self-massage or myofascial release or foam rolling routine is also something that's very effective, or getting your partner to massage you, or doing partner massage, or having sex, or kissing or something like that, or reading a book that sort of connects you to something, to whatever your spiritual connection is, or something. If you're not a spiritual or religious person, do something that connects you to something deeper that you find meaningful, and something that's ideally calming. So it might be reading philosophy or something like that. So this gives you an overview of how to do things to start optimizing the diurnal curve of your cortisol. So I've given you a variety of tips here, things that will boost morning cortisol levels back up to where they should be and amplify that natural rise in morning. And I've also given you a variety of strategies to help amplify the decrease in cortisol levels in the afternoon and evening and night hours. And by doing these strategies, you can absolutely correct low morning cortisol levels and a flat diurnal curve in cortisol levels within a few weeks. So these are simple things, but if you actually do them consistently, they are enormously powerful. And there's one more thing that I want to mention here, which is that all of these things that I just mentioned do so much more than just fix your cortisol levels. So yes, this will be a very fast way to fix your cortisol levels, but it also works on dozens of other systems of your body besides your adrenals and your cortisol levels, and can profoundly influence your health in a positive way and your energy levels, in a much more profound way than whatever it does to your cortisol levels. So just to give you an example of that, if you look at, for example, just circadian rhythm and sleep, just that alone is linked with, increased risk. If you have poor sleep or poor circadian rhythm habits, that is linked with increased risk of dozens of different diseases, kinds of cancers, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, neurological diseases, you name it. There's a huge body of rapidly accumulating evidence showing that those habits disturb all kinds of systems of the body, certainly not just cortisol. So if you do the things that I just recommended, you are likely to add many years or decades to your life and dramatically reduce your risk of various diseases. And I would say an added bonus to all of the real stuff that it's doing is that it's also going to correct your cortisol levels in the vast majority of people. So, summary. The evidence does not support the adrenal fatigue theory. Chronic stress is not reliably associated with low cortisol, and the evidence does not support the claim that there is a general pattern where chronic stress or chronic disease leads to adrenal fatigue or low cortisol levels. Number 2, stress-related exhaustion disorder and burnout syndrome and fatigue in general have no clear connection to abnormal cortisol levels or adrenal function. These conditions and symptoms are clearly not caused by low cortisol levels, and the vast majority of people with fatigue or burnout or stress-related exhaustion have perfectly normal cortisol levels. So remember, fixing your cortisol levels won't necessarily fix your fatigue and burnout symptoms. If you were to just say, take adrenal glandulars or take adrenals related, adrenal boosting supplements or take hydrocortisone, that is not a real solution to the symptoms of fatigue and burnout. You have to address things at the root cause level, and hopefully now I've explained all the layers to this story so that you sufficiently understand that just trying to fix your adrenals is not the solution. Having said that, if you do want to fix your adrenals and your cortisol levels, you need to understand that low morning cortisol levels or a flattened diurnal curve of cortisol levels are typically the result of some combination of the 20 lifestyle and environmental factors that I mentioned previously. But the biggest causes, the most common causes of low morning cortisol levels are circadian rhythm disruption, being a night owl, and poor sleep. Those are the three biggest factors that influence this the most strongly and are the most common by far. And these things are extremely common. 90+% of the population is going to have very significant circadian rhythm disruption and poor sleep quality. And a huge portion of the population are also night owls. So it's not as if these things are uncommon. It's actually remarkable that not everyone has low morning cortisol levels, given how common these things are. You would expect, and it is actually true, that a pretty sizable portion of the population, if they were tested, would show up as having low morning cortisol levels. And that's probably why it's so common for people to get diagnosed with adrenal fatigue, is because these factors are rampant. And so because circadian rhythm disruption and poor sleep are such epidemics, we have basically a majority of people that are probably going to test. If they are tested, they're probably going to be tested and have a flattened diurnal curve of cortisol and probably low-ish morning cortisol levels and maybe also slightly elevated evening cortisol levels. Less common causes, chronic inflammation or immune activation. That's especially a factor in people with more severe illness. Medications that people take chronically can potentially be a factor here. So Xanax, some antidepressants, opioids, anti-inflammatories, painkillers, very common ones, Tylenol, aspirin, things like that. Blood pressure lowering medications and a variety of other ones. Lack of physical activity, again, extremely common. Excess body fat, again, extremely common. Not being employed is not a typical one that most people would think of. Or taking the cortisol test on an off day from work, which would be sort of more in the category of a measurement error, but not being employed by itself, just sort of not having a sense of purpose and being goal-driven and being, actively pursuing, going after your goals and doing tasks and things like that can absolutely lower cortisol levels. Psychosocial factors, I kind of skipped over this, but if you go and read the article, there's more research if you want to explore this more in depth. So things like rumination, neuroticism, depression, perceived suffering, social isolation, low self-esteem, low social support, loneliness, and or low perceived coping ability. All of these things are linked with at least slight effects on lowering morning cortisol levels. There's also, it's rare, but still there, genetic influences. So ethnicity, there's some research showing a small effect, and different ethnic groups have slightly different morning cortisol levels. Family ancestry with the genetic variant that leads to 21-hydroxylase deficiency, or parents with a history of psychological or emotional trauma. Number 8, past history of trauma or childhood adversity yourself. And this is, potentially for some people could actually be a major factor. So I'm listing it here as a less common cause, but it is certainly possible if you are a person with severe past trauma, that could actually be by itself, maybe explain the entire reason that you have low morning cortisol levels. So these are, I've given, of the 20 factors in total that I listed, I've kind of ranked them here in terms of most common factors and the ones that have the biggest impact to a variety of the ones that are maybe less common or have less of an impact on cortisol levels. How to fix it? I gave you 11 strategies to fix it. Optimize your circadian rhythm, optimize your sleep habits, decrease inflammation and oxidative stress at the cellular level, movement and physical activity, meditation, mindfulness, yoga practices in the evening, optimize your light exposure habits, get bright light within the first 30 minutes of the day, talk with your doctor about medications that affect cortisol levels and see if you're on something that may be affecting your cortisol levels. Number 8, if you have a history of psychological abuse, trauma, etc., address that using the strategies I mentioned above. Number 9, or the strategies I mentioned previously, I should say. Number 9, amplify the normal rise and fall of cortisol at the appropriate time of day. So I gave you some examples of things that you can do in the morning and in the evening to amplify that natural rise and fall, and have a pre-bed ritual, including the strategies that I mentioned here to directly calm the brain and nervous system prior to bed. So this now gives you an overview of how to fix your low morning cortisol levels, and it gives you an overview of this whole landscape of the adrenal fatigue theory as a whole, and what's really going on. So now you understand beyond the hype, beyond the sort of all the articles and books that have been written on adrenal fatigue, now you actually have the evidence so you can see for yourself the truth about this adrenal fatigue theory. So again, to wrap up, adrenal fatigue is not supported by the evidence. The theory that symptoms of burnout and fatigue are primarily caused by problems with the adrenals or low cortisol levels is not supported by the evidence, and it makes no sense to try to focus on your adrenals or cortisol to resolve these issues. Yet, if you have a test showing that you have low morning cortisol levels, now you know the real reasons why people typically have low morning cortisol levels, and you know how to fix it. Also, abnormal cortisol levels can be a secondary contributor to health problems. So of course, it's smart to optimize cortisol levels. Now you know how to do that. Using the strategies I've outlined here will often correct low morning cortisol levels and high evening cortisol levels, many times within a matter of a few days, if not a few weeks. So now you understand the whole landscape of the science around adrenal fatigue. I hope you have enjoyed this massive presentation. Like I said, this has been a labor of love. This has taken me a huge amount of time to put together. So I hope that you have enjoyed it and found it educational. And I hope that you will like and subscribe to this YouTube channel, or like and subscribe to the Energy Blueprint podcast. If you want to go through and dig through all the scientific references and the studies and see some of the details that I skipped over in this presentation, you can find that all of that stuff in the article on my website. It's theenergyblueprint.com/low-cortisol-levels. So like or subscribe to the YouTube channel or the Energy Blueprint podcast on iTunes or whatever your favorite podcast platform is. And I will talk to you again very soon. Thank you for listening.